Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing Appetite for Self-Destruction by Steve Knopper. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview of what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Steve Knopper was an editor at Rolling Stone. I think he's now an editor at Billboard. He's a fairly prestigious music journalist. Besides this book, which came out in 2009, he also wrote a book on the life of Michael Jackson in 2015. This book, Appetite for Self-Destruction, is about the music business, the major label business between, I'd say, 1979 and 2008. So that almost 30-year period, which is really about the kind of the death of disco, the rise of MTV, the rise of CDs, and the beginning of digitization and the crash that followed after the introduction of Napster and other similar programs ate away at the record business. So I thought it was, for what it is, it's actually a really, really quick read, which I really enjoyed. I sped through this really quickly. This is a topic I find really interesting, so maybe that was part of it. But I think Steve does a good job of giving you the overview of each one of these eras and errors from the perspective of folks who were there. So he interviews probably a dozen or so record executives, people associated with the business. He interviews people who are associated with Napster. The Napster section is probably only about 50 pages of the book, of about 250 pages, but it's a pretty substantial section. He also interviews the creator of the MP3 format, one of the creators of the MP3 format, as well as the team who invented the compact disc. So he did do his research on this. I think the book is light and moves really quickly. He has sections in between the various chapters. It's basically a linear story starting with the late 70s all the way up to 2008. But he has in between those sections stories about how kind of just points where the music industry did something stupid, for lack of a better term. I think he calls it the big music's big mistakes or something to that effect. So he talks about what's known as spooling, which is where the record labels will pay people to upload fake copies of songs or damaged copies of songs to frustrate them from pirating music. He talks about the lack of singles in the late 90s and things of that nature, the digital rights management and all the plethora of ways that the big labels try to put digital rights protections on their compact discs and how that oftentimes backfired. If you're all interested in the business of big music, then I think it's really interesting. I think he goes through and gives you enough of each of these sections to kind of keep you interested without bogging you down too much in detail. I think if there was any things that I didn't like about it, I would have liked him to have had just a real quick summary of what music labels are, where they started in the 50s and 60s, and kind of up to the present day. I think it was weird that he started in 1979. It wasn't quite clear to me why he started with the kind of the death of disco and the kind of rise of MTV. But that's where he starts the book. I didn't quite understand that, why. And the book kind of ends in a strange kind of in-between place. It's something of a cultural relic because it ends in 2008, so it ends right before the next thing in music, which turned out to be streaming, took off. So Spotify is an active thing, Pandora is a thing, but neither of them have anywhere near the level of ubiquity that they have today. But it's an interesting book. He has very much a viewpoint of the record companies being very short-sighted, and I think there are legitimate reasons for that. I think he does a good job of debunking a couple places that there's kind of oftentimes this viewpoint that the record companies just didn't have any technologists on hand to really understand what was happening from the late 90s perspective when we started to see file sharing platforms like Napster come in, and they just didn't understand digital. And that's not really the case. They had a business model that was really designed to print money with CDs. It was just one of those things where you can make an argument that they were greedy by not offering CD singles, and you can make an argument that they didn't do a very good job of investing in A&R to really water some of these bands. And he makes that point as well in the book, but the model they had kicked off a ton of cash. He also kind of goes into talking about how mergers and acquisitions played a large part in all this stuff, and the people at the top were really driven to cut costs and to make as much money as possible because they were now part of kind of larger corporate entities. So I think he does a good job of going through all that. There's a couple points, like I said in the book. He spends quite a bit of time on Lou Pearlman and the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. I don't know if we needed as much time spent there as we got, and I don't know why the book started in the late 70s. I think, like I said, if he had had a brief chapter, even if just like 1 or 2 pages on here's what record companies are, here's what their history is, if you wanted to start at that point and then jump into the 70s, I guess you could have. Wasn't quite clear why we started there. Who would I recommend this book to? If you're all interested in kind of the intersection of music, technology, and business, I think this is actually a really strong overview. I knew a lot of this stuff already because this is a topic that I'm really interested in, but I think from an overview perspective, you could do a lot worse than this. If you have seen the movie Downloaded, which is the Alex Winters documentary he did a few years ago before he did the latest Frank Zappa documentary, I actually highly recommended that. I highly recommend that doc. I would say watch it and then read this book because they go hand in hand. And that book is basically the rise and fall of Napster and the footprint that Napster has had afterwards. That movie came out a little bit more recently, so some of the material on it is a little bit fresher than this. But I think they basically both tell the same story of the record companies were really very fat and happy, and they really didn't have any kind of urge to change. There's nothing really pushing them to change, and then Napster kind of came along and served as a catalyst to change everything about the record industry, and for better or for worse. And I think that this book goes into a little bit of a deeper dive into some of those things in terms of what the record companies did, what they could have done, what they should have done. And like everything, when you get 20 people's opinions on anything, there's a lot of debates about what they could have done, what they should have done, what they knew, what they didn't know, and kind of all those things. So I think it was really an interesting look at it. You kind of see the RIAA, which is the Recording Industry Association of America, which is essentially a trade group of the major labels, and what they did to try to fight piracy and what they could have done, and maybe in hindsight what they should have done. It's questionable whether or not they would have ever signed a deal with the Napster folks. I think the book posits, and I think the movie posits too, that Steve Jobs basically stepped into a vacuum where people wanted digital music, but they didn't trust, the major labels didn't trust someone who was essentially 19 and had no experience whatsoever with companies dealing with anything of this size. Steve Jobs kind of steps in, makes the Apple iTunes store, and makes a ton of money that the record companies really, to really understand some of the reticence to do this, you really do see the numbers behind going from selling a CD for $18, $19, $20 to selling a single song and making, I think the iTunes store took I think 33 cents of every dollar, so they're left with 66 cents for a single song, and that's just a song. But I think the point the book makes is that the record company is built on albums and charging you $20 for an album, even if you only like 1 or 2 songs. It kind of goes back to the A&R and all that stuff. But if you're at all interested in this topic, or if you kind of wanted just to learn more about record companies, how they operate, some of the largesse that they had, especially during this time, I think it's a good look at that. So that is Appetite for Self-Destruction by Steve Knopper. And next time I'm going to be still finishing up T.C. Boyle's The Terranauts. Till next time, please feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll have my Twitter handle below if you want to follow me on Twitter. Till next time, bye.